I'm Laura London, and this is the borrowed dust of Speaking of Jung. Returning to us today for episode 138 is Jungian psychoanalyst and author Dr. James Hollis in Washington, D.C. He earned a Ph.D. in literature from Drew University and taught humanities in the philosophic traditions of cultures for over 25 years before training as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute Zürich, where he earned a diploma in analytical psychology, which is the degree of a Jungian analyst, in 1982. Dr. Hollis is the co-founder and first director of training of the Philadelphia Jung Institute, worked as a senior training analyst for the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, and from 1998 to 2008 served as executive director of the C.G. Jung Educational Center in Houston, Texas. In 2014, he relocated to Washington, D.C., where he spent the next 5 years as executive director of the Jung Society of Washington and now serves on its board of directors. He is also vice president emeritus of the Philemon Foundation and a former professor of Jungian Studies at Saybrook University in San Francisco. Dr. Hollis continues to lecture online and to write. He is the author of 20 books, and I now have them all, available in translations around the world. His titles are in order: Harold Pinter, The Middle Passage, Under Saturn's Shadow, Tracking the Gods, Swamplands of the Soul, The Eden Project, The Archetypal Imagination, Creating a Life, On This Journey We Call Our Life, Mythologems, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, Why Good People Do Bad Things, What Matters Most, Hauntings, Living an Examined Life, Living Between Worlds, Prisms, The Broken Mirror, A Life of Meaning, and his latest, Living with Borrowed Dust, Reflections on Life, Love, and Other Grievances, scheduled to be published tomorrow, March 4th, by Sounds True. Dr. Hollis has joined us on 7 previous episodes of Speaking of Jung, including our celebratory 100th episode in 2022. Please visit the special James Hollis page on our website for a comprehensive look at his work, including links to his previous episodes, all of his books, audiobooks, films, print interviews, his lecture schedule, and a series of online video courses through the Jung Society of Washington and Soul at Play that you can start at any time, work at your own pace, and enjoy lifetime access to the material. Please consider helping Speaking of Jung stay on the air by contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or by making a one-time or recurring donation through PayPal. You can find the links in the description box below, or by visiting the support page on our website, speakingofjung.com. You can also help our YouTube channel grow by clicking the thumbs up on this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. It's free and it helps us get more exposure. I am also here to remind you of the importance of recording your dreams. Temenos Dream is a revolutionary dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Search for myths, legends, and fairy tales related to the themes in your dreams. Use the new advanced AI interpretation with a focus on Jung's work, looking closely at symbols and associations to consider shadow, anima, animus, archetypes, and much more. You can help support Speaking of Jung simply by downloading the app and creating a free account. Unlimited use is available with a premium subscription. Click on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview is being recorded on Monday, March 3rd, 2025, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Dr. Hollis.
Good morning, Laura. I was just thinking when you read all of those titles, it's kind of like having 20 children. It would be embarrassing not to be able to remember the name of each of those children. And I wouldn't want them to feel unloved, but I think it would press me to be able to recite them all. So I'm glad you did. Thank you.
I told you this in email, I finally got a copy of your first book, Harold Pinter, The Poetics of Silence. And I just want to say, just the preface alone, Dr. Hollis, you wrote this when you were 29 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I could see the Jungian analyst in you just by reading the preface.
Well, that's very interesting. because I was only 29 and I didn't start any Jungian analysis until I was 35 and graduated as an analyst in 42. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's surprising that you say that. So I'll have to go back and take a look.
I was wondering if you were going to agree or say really, but I was stunned. So the Jungian analyst was in you all along, and first of all, it's great to see you, and I'm so happy that we're both still here.
I am too, and it's great to see you as well.
Thank you. And I want to mention this. You were on CNN, and that was a big deal to me. I would imagine it was to you. I'm going to let you tell us. But on Friday, today's Monday, so a few days ago, you had a conversation. I like to call things an interview, but it was a conversation along with Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is a neurobiology professor at Stanford. And you were on his podcast last year, and it got over 2 million views. I will provide a link to it in the show notes. But you were interviewed by Pamela Brown in kind of the middle of the day. It was 10 a.m. here. I think was it 11 a.m. or vice versa?
It was 10:30 Eastern time.
10:30 Eastern. It was 9:30 a.m. here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of exposure. And I'd like to know if you would tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, frankly, it was a little nerve-wracking. It was postponed twice.
Yes.
Once, over a year ago when Her Majesty the Queen died, and that was obviously big.
Mm.
And then it was postponed in January when the terrible fires hit in Los Angeles. So, and then we had the president of Ukraine coming to the White House, that horrible interview that he had. And so we didn't know until the last minute if we were going to be on. And I'm an introvert, so I don't enjoy all of that uncertainty, but it certainly increased my appreciation for the anchors of television who are able to be so light on their feet and move, with the news and flow and pick up where people left off something or respond to them. And it's an extraordinary experience. So it was just surprising that, we were able to have that conversation on a subject of that nature when we're very much in the context of a kind of revising of values in this country for good or for ill.
Mm-hmm. And the topic was masculinity and mental health.
Yes.
And was that the topic when you were originally approached to do this on CNN? It was because the Queen died, and I believe it was September of 2022. So this has been in the works for some time.
Well, yes. Initially, they wanted to talk about men's loneliness, and that was the topic. And so this was certainly related and fed into that. So,
and as
you know, it's so hard to get. You can make assertions, but you can't get the supportive evidence. There are lifetimes of experiences that go into making those generalizations, and they float sort of unsubstantiated in television. And it tells me it's not my medium, with exceptions like this where I can respond to direct questions. We have time to follow up and so forth. So, and we had more time. I think it was about 15 minutes, counting commercials, than usual on television.
Yes, I was surprised at how long. Actually, they took a break and then continued after the break. And again, that time of day during the week, lots of exposure. And I was very happy about that. And I know that you can't get into great depth in something like that, but you can plant seeds. And Pamela Brown mentioned your book, Under Saturn's Shadow. And then at the end, she thanked you and told you what a profound impact you have had on her life. Dealing with the death of her mother, and she specifically mentioned your book, Living an Examined Life. So I want to thank her for that, and I did on Instagram, and so I applaud CNN for covering this topic and having you on. But we're here today to talk about your new book, and so I'm curious as to whether you planned this book. And if you have another one in the works, and how does this go for you with book after book after book, which we are all so grateful for?
Well, this book wasn't planned. I think it happens in two ways. Two or three of the topics in the book. It's a collection of about 10 or 11 essays on various subjects, from happiness to politics to the problem of evil and so forth. Two of them, at least, were in response to requests for conferences where I was invited to speak.
Yeah.
And so that was almost an assigned topic. And others were essays that rose sort of out of the earth or wherever they come from. So in some level, the books are not planned. They happen. They start bubbling from below and they come up, just as dreams do. Now, on the other hand, I'm actually working on another book right now with a
Great.
marvelous painter by the name of Enrique Celaya, who I met while speaking at the Los Angeles Jung Institute a number of years, about a decade ago. And this was his proposal, that the two of us address some very deep topics and respond in personal ways, not academic ways, but personal ways about it, having to do with, the creative process and how a work of art or a work of prose or whatever does come to the surface. And so we've worked up about 15 topics, and I've been writing and he's writing, and then we're going to compare what each has said and respond to each other, like that sort of a conversation. And I think it's going to be a very interesting exploration of the boundary between art, philosophy, and depth psychology. So
Interesting.
it was something that I hadn't even thought of doing, and yet here's the invitation. And I found myself able to write rather easily because I wasn't having to go look something up or do some research or think about pulling threads together. It was just respond personally and naturally. So there's a lot more personal material in this book. And I have yet to read his response, which is due any day now. And so I'll be very interested to see what he's produced.
That's interesting that you mention art, because the last episode I did with Shireen Bismaya, we're in this 21-day intensive, and she's using a lot of art. And I thought about what Jung said about the image. And I noticed that I respond to the material in a different way, in a more engaged way, when it's words and then image, word and image. It's why I always mention that book, C.G. Jung, Word and Image. Anyway, I'm getting far afield here. So I don't know if you want to say anything about what Jung said about the image.
Sure. Jung said psyche is image. In other words, psyche itself is invisible, just as the wind's invisible. But you can see its effect on everything else. So it may show up as an image in our body, in our behavioral patterns, in our dream life, and so forth. And only then is it potentially available to consciousness. So we have to see the problem with depth psychology is we're trying to get at the invisible. And by definition, that's difficult, as is true that we can't say anything directly about the unconscious, and yet we can perceive its effects everywhere. So we have to track our dream images, the images and clusters that show up in our behavioral patterns, the images that show up in the body through the feeling function, through the energy systems, and so forth. So there are clues. It's not easy work. One thinks it's easy to sit there and say, to somebody. It's really intense work, because you have to be trying to move from what is visible to what is invisible, and then bring that back into the world of consciousness. And that's a hermetic function. That is to say, one of the gods, Hermes, and his Latin form is, Mercurius, whom you see, in the Western Union image, because he's the carrier of messages. So it's this going back and forth between the invisible world and the visible world, because the invisible world, and I don't want to sound strange about this, but the invisible world is just as real as the visible world. The visible world is the world we can make conscious because it unfolds, but from whence does it come? And what is it in service to? Those are the real questions that often are not addressed in people's lives.
I had chuckled a bit ago, because as I was preparing for this episode, I was given an advance copy of your book, Thank You to Sounds True, and I listened to it. I read it and I listen to it. And I was listening to it again as I was getting ready. And I stopped it and ran to my notes and put this in bold and underline. In chapter 8, which we'll get to, you say suit up means to prepare, do one's necessary homework, and not expect an easy path in life. And it made me burst out laughing because I get so frustrated every day when things are difficult. And I find myself saying, why must everything be so difficult? And here you are saying not to expect an easy path in life, which brings me to the beginning of the book. I would like to start here.
Mhm.
You open the book with the following. In the past 5 years, I have had elective knee and hip replacements, non-elective cancer treatments involving surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, deep vein thrombosis surgery, and 2 major spinal operations as the vertebrae of my spine dissolved and fractured, possibly as a result of the cancer treatment. Additionally, my pelvis is now attached to my spine by bolts. Yet here you are today in a suit, showed up on time. You are 84 years old, been through all that, and here you are. And that says so much to me, inspires me, motivates me. I tell everybody I know, tell us, why aren't you sitting somewhere with your feet up watching television?
Well, I don't know either. It strikes me as peculiar. To that long list, I think I need to add a partridge in a pear tree because it's quite a list when you think about it.
And thank you for sharing that with us, by the way, because I think I want people to know that.
Yeah. Well, this is going to sound banal, but it's true. This work is very meaningful for me. It's not easy. Thomas Mann said once, writing is an act that is especially difficult for writers.
Mm.
And secondly, the painter Chuck Close, who also had his spine dissolve, and he couldn't paint anymore, and so he had to evolve a different kind of painting. And by the way, his painting of President Clinton's in the National Portrait Gallery now. He's now deceased, but he said amateurs wait for inspiration. The rest of us show up early at the studio and get to work. So I've always had a good work ethic, and I think about, as I head into 85, what else would you be doing that would be meaningful to you? Because there was part of me that wants to sit and watch television, and once in a while I do.
Yeah.
But all of the books have to be written in the evening after a workday. So
Yeah.
there has to be some inner drive that's there. And I don't want to sound grandiose about this. Trust me, it's not my intention. But, the Greeks use the term the daimon. That's that tutelary spirit between humans and the gods. Socrates said, I don't speak, but the daimon speaks through me. There's been some kind of daimon around teaching from childhood on. And I think at one level, the more conscious level, I was grateful to my teachers when I was a child because I realized they were opening the world to me. And it was not unlike being able to go on an airplane. You could go places that you'd heard about, but you didn't know for yourself until you experienced it. And that was marvelous. But secondly, as I've gotten older, and that's one of the things that comes out of that new book that we're writing with Celaya, that I became aware that for my parents' world and for the people I knew in childhood, their life was circumscribed by lack of education, lack of opportunity. They never saw alternatives in life. They never saw a chance to engage the world. If you can get a job and hang on to it, then you're golden, so to speak. It doesn't matter what the job is. And they went through the Depression and so forth. My father was pulled out of 8th grade, believe it or not, and sent to work when the Depression came. Well, his life at some level ended at that point. He wanted to be a physician, but it was like, you go to work. And he worked in a pharmacy, and then when he was 16, he worked in a factory the rest of his life. So surrounded by that, I think it's trying to, and again, I'm trying not to sound grandiose here. I find this humbling. it's like I'd like to open the world for people like my parents, but of course a child can't
Mm.
be his parents, And I grew up just 200 miles from where you are in Springfield, Illinois,
Yeah.
and I'm privileged to have had the opportunity to get a college education and take off from there. And so I know in other eras that would never have happened. Read Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure to see the story of a person who was blocked from marrying the woman he loved and couldn't go on to school and so forth. And it was a portrait of the class system, that was so
Mm.
restrictive that the doors never opened for him. So at any rate, I think that that's been a driver in there. The older I get, the more I see the importance of that. Because the question I ask of clients from time to time about any behavior or idea, where is this coming from inside of you? What is that in service to inside of you? Because we can rationalize almost any behavior out there, but where's it really coming from? And you can't trust your first response. You really have to
Yeah.
track it a little bit further until you get some click inside that says, yes, that's really what it's about. That in doing so, you have to really get at what are the drivers in your life, and that driver's still there. Because I do think about stopping writing. In fact, the distance between the Pinter book, which I frankly wrote as a young academic, was to demonstrate that I could do that. That's what academics are supposed to do, And I didn't write for another 20 years. And there was something inside of me was resisting, feeling that I had to do something. And then when the door opened, of course, during that time too, raising a family and being in Zurich for training and trying to build a practice and so forth. So I was gainfully employed. But then when my daughter drove through town and had finished graduate school, was headed off to her new life in Texas, I thought, what would you tell a person that came to you with this? It was kind of empty nest syndrome kind of reaction. And I said, well, the energy you spent was well spent. There she is. She's on her way. Perfect. Now, what are you going to do with that energy? Because it now comes back to you. And while she's driving, I started that night, the Middle Passage. And then all these books have come out since. So the difference was, of course, I wasn't being coerced outwardly. That's which I was resisting, I think, to the fact that there was a urgency from within, which it's frankly fatal to resist too long, because that's what the gods are asking of you, and you better beware of running from that.
Yes. Yes. And before we started this, I think it was before we started, you mentioned that that speaking of Jung was back, and I had taken almost a year off. And I did that so I could take a job, a paying job that was too good to pass up. And while I was doing it, I was happy to do it, but there was no meaning in that work. It was not something that called to me or came from within. And so it was, I'm just going to say it was drudgery. And when it came to an end, which I didn't choose to end it, it came to an end, the project came to an end, I immediately started speaking of Jung back up again, even though I have struggled with it off and on we're in our 10th, this is our 10th year off and on, but it calls to me. There's still more work to be done, and it does have a lot of meaning, despite how difficult it is. And because when you mentioned that writing is difficult for writers, this is difficult for me, but there's something inside me that it's like a motor that it goes. So
Yes. And see, that's the difference in some way between the first and second half of life. First half of life is like building an ego where you have to leave your parents, step into the world, form a relationship, support yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But in the second half, if you're granted a second half, is to raise the question, now, why am I really here? And what wants to enter the world through me? See, in some way, the first half is about the ego saying, what does the world want from me?
Mhm.
And then what do I want? And then second half is what wants to enter the world through me. That's a different question. And then you may, if you're fortunate, encounter a vocation, vocatus, calling. And you have it in your work that you're doing here, which is educative, and it's also treating the wounded soul of America and other countries, you see. So that's no small thing. But I don't imagine you fully understood that when you started. But
No.
something comes out of that that you know feels right for you, and
Mhm.
then it's a privilege, but it's also a burden, and it involves a certain sacrifice in order to serve something, and you're rewarded by doing it because it's meaningful to you. That's the
Mhm.
because you could have kept that other job or one like it for the rest of your life, and you'd wind up hating yourself.
Right. And the wounded soul of myself as well.
Of all of us as well. Yes.
Right.
Mhm.
So getting back to the book, because I love this book and I want to share some of it with the listeners. It will be released tomorrow. It is available for pre-order on Amazon right now. There will be a link in the show notes, in the description on this video. And I have notes on every single chapter, and we, of course, don't have time to get through all of it. So I've picked out some of the things, I've highlighted all of these pages of notes, some of the things that really stood out to me. And the first chapter is titled Happiness. Find what you love and let it kill you. I need to ask you what you mean by that.
Yes, that's a line that I took from a poet, and um, I think what it's saying is because I think so many of us are fed the notion we're supposed to be happy, and people are unhappy because they're not happy all the time.
Yeah.
Happiness is contextual. You know, when you're thirsty, a glass of cold water makes you very happy at the moment, but very transitory and very contextual. Happiness is the byproduct ultimately of being in right relationship to your own soul, and paradoxically, that can be in situations which are not happy situations. I could not have imagined as a child spending a good part of my life sitting and listening to people suffering. But it doesn't make me happy to hear that, but it makes me happy to be part of that kind of conversation that takes
Mhm.
people into a shared human journey. And so happiness is really a byproduct. And it's again when you're in right relationship to it. So if you fasten on an object or some kind of ideology out there to make you happy, having attained it, you'll still feel empty, lonely. You'll still feel disconnected. So it's like, what do you care enough about it that you're willing to sacrifice yourself for it? And that's Jack Lukowski's poem is about that. What do you care about enough that in serving it might actually hurt you in some
Mhm.
way, even physically, and yet it's a gift to you. It's a calling, a gift, and it's a surrender to something larger than your ego satisfactions, which is what
Mhm.
people think about when they think about happiness.
Mhm. Something really got me in this chapter, something that I've probably known or read or thought about before, but I really made the connection. It was just yesterday when I was rereading it. The connection between happiness and consciousness.
Mhm.
And that word is bandied about a lot, consciousness, and it can mean different things. So, what did I write here? Let's. I asked. I want to ask you about your definition of consciousness, and um, I struggle with that word with when I say that to people because you know what? I used to work in neurology and I used to do EEGs way back when I was just out of college. And we were trying to see if somebody was brain dead or not. So that level of consciousness, are they conscious or unconscious? And I'm not explaining that very well, but
Mhm.
you also ran up against that word. If I just read this, that'll be a little easier. I struggle with being understood when I use that word as well as the word unconscious, as you did with the nurse when you were describing how the psychology that you practice, this is in the book, differs from other psychologies. So, the connection between happiness and consciousness, and how you said something about people that aren't very, I'm afraid to say this, people that aren't very conscious
Mm-hmm.
are more happy.
Well, that's a possibility. There's a chapter in this book on the problem of evil, too. Nothing makes me happy about that, I can assure you there. And yet I'm conscious enough to realize how central it is, how important it is. So I think that, and by the way, I should just mention that story. I was about to undergo a procedure at a hospital, and the nurse, I think to distract me, was asking what I did. And I told her, and she said, well, how does that differ from psychiatry? And I said, well, they tend to focus more on medication and so forth. And she said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, we try to evoke a conversation with the unconscious. She thought a while, literally 2 or 3 minutes, and then she came back. She says, oh, I get it. You must work with people in comas, right? Which was funny. I don't quite remember what I said, but it was just, a pleasant rejoinder. And then I said, well, in a way, that's true, because people are in complexes at any given time. Because the truth is, we don't particularly know what consciousness is either. Because anybody, if you ask a person, are you conscious? Well, they're going to say, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And not just in the literal sense, that they're attentive to the moment. But we often have to say that many times, if not much of our waking life, is spent under the influence of a complex of some kind or another. So can I say that I'm really conscious when I'm serving some energy or some agenda that's come from my own psychological history, rising from the unconscious, usurping the ego, being a lens through which I see the world, distorting it as it may do? Can I really say I'm conscious there? I'm in a state of possession, actually, which is the term Jung used in German, that meant being under the influence of a cluster of energy. So we'd have to say of consciousness, there's the capacity to reflect upon itself, the capacity to, that's why the question comes up vis-a-vis artificial intelligence. Has it ever reached a point where it can reflect upon itself? And could it acknowledge a feeling state or something like that? There are many tests of consciousness, and the biological functions are important, but also at some level superficial. So, consciousness is also paradoxically the source of our neuroses. You can see that in the story of Eden, where there's the tree of life, from which you can partake, and the tree of knowledge. So it's like, as long as you're grounded in your instincts, you know what's right for you at the moment, at least. But the moment you become conscious, then you have another agenda which may be in competition. That's why Freud was trying to get at that in this notion of the nature of nature naturing, what he called the id, and the oughts and shoulds that the culture says these are the rules of the game, and the ego is running back and forth between the two, trying to keep them harmonized, which is going to drive you a little crazy. That's how we all become neurotic. So, as Blake wrote, the priests in their black gowns are making their rounds and binding with briars our joys and desires. So consciousness is a mixed gift, and yet it's allowed us to be able to reflect on the meaning and purpose of life and to make some important decisions in our lives rather than just be driven by whatever forces come up. But consciousness needs to continue to critique itself, which is one of the reasons we pay attention to our symptoms, which come up autonomously from our psyche, and also our dreams, because consciousness does not create the dream. Something else in us, some other agency, some energy that knows us better than we know ourselves, can be critiquing consciousness, as often is the case. So there are different kinds of intelligence and different kinds of consciousness. And you see why it's complicated,
Right.
and it gets more and more difficult to. Um, so happiness tends, as I said, to be a byproduct of an experience. And often the more we intend on something to make us happy, the more likely we are to be disappointed in the outcome, which is why people get disappointed in a relationship or some marvelous adventure that they're going to take or something.
Yeah.
Whereas often the best moments of our lives are the things that happen spontaneously, and there was no attendance of consciousness upon it. But then later you realize, oh, that was so powerful there.
Mhm. Moving ahead to the next chapter, something that stood out to me is that you say, we do not do crazy things. We do logical things based on the stories activated intrapsychically. And I took from that based on our complexes. We do not do crazy things. We do logical things based on those complexes.
Mm-hmm. Sure. In other words, if you take a behavioral pattern which is counterproductive to you, let's say, why would I continue to do that if I'm conscious of it? Well, it's a logical expression of some agency within me that has a quantity of energy attached to it that can autonomously usurp consciousness and play out its program. Or dream images are good examples. We can have very peculiar dream images, peculiar to consciousness. But if you say, now, what could that mean symbolically? Then you begin to realize there's no such thing as a bad dream. There are dreams that raise issues that we prefer not to address, but they're still seeking our healing and integration of this in, the cooperation of consciousness. And so what we try to do, I mean, I can give you examples. I just remember quickly working in a psychiatric hospital, and there was a fellow who kept trying to break a window. People thought he was trying to escape, but we were like 3 stories above the ground, and or maybe get a shard for self-injury. And so finally, someone got conscious and asked him why, and he had this convincing delusion, simply a mistaken belief that, and he was in a locked ward, so he couldn't leave, that the room was sealed and that somebody was pumping air out of the room. Now, if you have that piece of information, the most logical thing you could do is to break a window.
Yeah.
Which is what he was trying to do. And so it's just an example of the way in which our behaviors rise out of something going on inside of us. And the real task is to find out what's going on inside of us and get some handle. Because if we pay no attention to that, we will be creatures of automatic behaviors. We could live an entire life in a semi-conscious state. That's why so often you see people towards the end of their life or on their proverbial deathbed becoming aware of something. It's because they were carried by all of the ideologies and complexes and promptings of their culture. Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich in 1885 is a classic example of that. John Johnson in Russian, Ivan Ilyich, married the right person, went to the right school, had the right profession, lived in the right neighborhood, did all of these things. Finally, when he's dying, he asks, in a sense, was I really here? What did matter in my life? And nobody wants to talk to him about it because it's his life and his imminent death, except the peasant, the illiterate peasant who is assigned to him as a caretaker. And they have a conversation about life. And he lives the last 3 days of his life for the first time because he becomes self-aware. And much of what he becomes aware of was not pretty because he realized how much energy was spent in pursuing false values.
So just moving along here on the interest of time, you have a chapter on addictions, and you say we all have addictions if one understands that addiction is merely a reflexive anxiety management technique. Then the following chapter is on active imagination, and something that I pulled out of here is you wrote, only when adhering to an image can the unconscious become conscious. And that's going back to what we were talking about at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as with dreams, some images resist interpretation. I thought that was really interesting because we all struggle to understand our dreams, and that sometimes a dream will never be understood.
Well, I think that's probably true. It's sort of what they say about poetry. I mean, serious poets say this. A poem is never finished, it's only abandoned. So you could never say entirely that you have fully understood a dream, particularly a powerful dream. You certainly could have gotten a good impression of it, that's for sure. And Jung himself said, I always said to clients, I don't know what this dream means.
Yeah.
Let's sit down together and we'll sort of fret it about until out of that, certain images and resonant feelings will arise, which will help us open some points of entry here. And one has to be humble before that, because that's why I never respond to people who send me a dream of theirs. First of all, we're not in a confidential setting. We don't have the time and energy to devote to that. And there's no snap judgment anyhow.
Right.
I have an idea about what an image might mean, but so I just stoutly refuse to do that, because I think it's out of respect for their privacy, but it's also out of respect for the complexity of the psyche.
Yes. And then the following chapter, chapter 5, is on dreams. It's titled Spectral Visitants.
Mhm.
And I thought that was interesting that you also referred to dreams as corrective. What did you mean by that?
Well, the kind of dreams that Jung frequently focused upon were what he called compensatory dreams. So my pressures from my society, my own inhibitions or my own promptings will send me off in this direction. But then over here, where's the rest of your personality? We leave parts of ourselves behind. So those are, in a certain way, abandoned clusters of energy, and they will, in time, begin to insist on being heard and respected.
Yeah.
And if they don't, they'll pathologize in some way. So, the truth is, as I've written about many times elsewhere, I didn't set off to become a Jungian analyst. I was having a good life by all external standards in my mid 30s
Mhm.
when a depression reached up and grabbed me and pulled me under. And I had unwittingly, and I'm not criticizing myself here, I think, led the life of the academic, the life of the mind, as a compensation for and as some way a transcendence of a lot of unfinished business from childhood.
Mhm.
So the psyche said, we're not going to let you get away with this. We're going to pull you down and send you back right into this, you see. And so within that, I think you could see that the psyche's intent was not my happiness. That's a
Right.
superficial way of looking at it. It was more about wholeness, not that we ever achieve that, but these other parts. It's like having neglected children. Some of your children are healthy, some are starving. And the starving children are starting to protest, and you better pay attention to them.
Mhm. The following chapter is on the divided soul, divided nation.
Mm-hmm,
And after that is when you stare into the abyss.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Our frenetic culture, you say, rushing somewhere and hoping to get there quickly, is essentially fleeing death anxiety.
mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting
Well,
because this frenzied. I keep hearing the term information overload,
mm-hmm.
and yeah,
Well, yes, we are bombarded with stimuli even more now because of the internet and so forth. And when people are deprived of the internet, they have addiction reactions for
mhm,
sure, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, etc. And in a way, the human experience is an experience of separation, of loss. I was reflecting when you read the title of the book, The Eden Project. which sounds like a spy novel. And that's somewhat the reason I use that title. But the hidden desire of relationship is to reconnect with my mother, because our life begins connected, and then we're violently and radically thrown into this life utterly defenseless, and life is perilous, and then you die, so have a nice day, baby. And the child is there saying, what's going on here? So there's a desire to find in the other, whether it's religion or relationship or wealth or whatever you project it onto, that primal, or drugs, the primal reconnection, you see. And in doing so, have a feeling of coming home, of being nurtured, taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. Well, our journey, though, requires separation. Consciousness requires separation, which was mythopoetically intuited, of course, in the Garden of Eden and Book of Genesis. So what one sees in this project is an ongoing recognition and of our disconnected state. And so the busyness and so many other distractions, you have to then say, from what am I distracting?
Yeah.
That's the key.
That's the key.
Ultimately, I think it's the perilous nature of this journey that ends in your decease. And also a lot of life's other troubles. When the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. There's a marvelous poem by Tony Hoagland about visiting the Galleria shopping mall, which we once lived within 2 miles of there in Houston.
Yeah.
And he says, and you really should read it, it's online, at the Galleria shopping mall, he's taking his granddaughter to go on her first shopping trip, and he said she's cutting through the piles of stuff to buy with her scythe-like credit card, and he said the gods created shopping malls to help us experience our loneliness. That line just grabs you at the end there, you realize, because it's all about, you gotta get out there and connect to that, whatever it is, stuff that you won't even want to look at next year at this time. And that's the grand failure of materialism. In other words, if you want to know what people's religion is, you have to say, where do they most spend their time and energy? Where do they most spend their own sort of mental treatment? And by and large, for a culture, the modern cultures, it's been in materialism.
Yeah.
And materialism, of course, is a failed religion. That is to say, it doesn't link you to anything transcendent or truly larger, but it offers the promise, the latest shiny thing, the latest technology. You go and have that in your au courant, and you're also going to have some new power and status until the next version comes out.
So how did we get there? Here? How did we get here? What happened?
I think in the long run, it's been the erosion of tribal mythology. Jung himself said, and it's a very interesting sentence, he said at the end of the 19th century, we had to invent depth psychology to help individuals find their path through the thicket of the modern world, because heretofore it was served by tribal mythology that addressed those 4 great questions in life. That's the cosmos. Why are we here? What's the place of the earth in the great spinning planets out there? Who are the gods? What happens when we die? Those questions don't go away. If people are not asking them directly today, they're being asked in the unconscious, and they come out as projections onto various ideologies or objects or whatever. Secondly, what is our relationship to nature, which we know we've really messed up? Thirdly, who is my tribe? To whom do I belong? Who are my people? And more and more people are tribeless in a way. We are partly through geographic location, but significantly through ideological disconnect. Estranged, lonely, unconnected. And fourthly, there's the mystery of individual journey. By what lights do you make your choices? How do you find your way through the plethora of choices that you have to deal with in your lifetime and so forth? Take that away, and as Jung said in one of his letters, the modern fell off the roof of the medieval cathedral into the abyss of the self, you see. And there we swim, whether people know that or not.
Mm.
Therefore, individuals are needing to be able to find a source of connection and a link to a story larger than the mere pleasure principle of their ego world.
In the final chapter, and I know that we're coming up on the time that we have to go, the final chapter, chapter 10, which is titled Bundles of Darkness, Moments of Meeting, the Despoiled and Present State of the Soul. You say that your book, Tracking the Gods, The Place of Myth in Modern Life, is perhaps your most important book. You say the most important book I ever wrote, yet it is among the least read, as myth is already a disqualifier for the attention of the modern reader. For who has any interest in the gods anymore? And that's reminding me what you just spoke about.
Yes. No, that's what I was suggesting there. And I was deeply moved when I came across the sentence while a student in Zurich, where did the gods go when they left Olympus? If they're
Jung wrote.
Yes, Jung said it. And where are they if they're gods? They're immortal, right? And he said their energies left. And what was left behind were the verbal husks that we call Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite and Apollo and so forth. Those energies are the things that are timeless. It's the name or the concept that passes in time. And I thought it was profound, because then it said to me, well, then our task is to track the gods, that is to say, track the energies, not to lead to a revivalism of Zeus and company, but to find out where those energies go. And he goes on to say, the gods left Olympus and entered the solar plexus of the modern, which means, and he said they've become often diseases and disorders. So it's like, when people had a kind of larger story, flush with energy, that linked them in a felt way to a transcendent perspective, they had a sense of psychic belonging that we tend to lack. That's why people constantly are pushing dogma or certain strict practices, because it's no longer a felt experience. So they have to discipline consciousness to the degree it can happen. But beneath that is the real question: where are those energies in my life, and how do I live in harmony with them and serve them in a responsible and conscious way?
And after chapter 10, which is the last chapter, there's an epilogue, and you remind us, keep asking the large questions. Large questions give you a larger life.
Yes. Yeah, and it's natural for that child lying there to ask the question, so who's going to take care of me? Who's going to fix it for me? Who's going to feed me, etc.? Now, that's appropriate for the infant and for the child. But somewhere along the line, it becomes our responsibility. It shifts to us. And we all know that consciously, but unconsciously, there's always this desire. And that's why if you don't have large questions, it's because you're trying to live out the responses to your old questions. I can tell you that they're not going to last that long. They won't serve you in new stages of the journey. We have to continuously revise. There's a wonderful line in Rilke. It doesn't please my ego, but it satisfies the soul. He said, we have to live continuously being defeated by ever larger things. Now, my ego says, what do you mean defeated? I want to win this, right?
Yeah.
No, what you gain today will be defeated by better questions and better instruments that are coming along in your life. And you will find shortly that yesterday's answers are no longer applicable. And the more you hang on to them, the more you're going to realize that they don't serve you. And then you have to undertake the journey. And that's what leads us to the next stage of our experience.
In the epilogue, you also write, and we'll close with this, we must daily, but not morbidly, recall Stanley Kunitz's reminder, I only borrowed this dust. Sooner or later, we have to return the loan.
Yes. Well, that's where the book title is not a very elegant title. It's not like Gone with the Wind or something, but
That's great.
It's, we are dust. We know that. And we are in transition. If you look under your bed, they say most of what's under your bed is discarded human skin. So somebody down there is coming and going, and it's probably you. So, people the more they're identified with the ego, the more they'll be terrified of change, aging, and mortality.
Yeah.
The more we identify with the soul, the more we realize it's because we're mortal that life is meaningful, because it obliges us to raise these kinds of questions that your programs raise. And that's what gives us an adventuresome and developmental life, rather than one that's stuck in infantility and dependency.
Thank you, Dr. Hollis.
Well, Laura, it's a pleasure always. You're one of my favorite interviewers because you've always done your homework and show up prepared, and obviously have found your calling, your métier, and in so doing, you help others.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your time today.
You are welcome.
Speaking of Jung is not just a podcast, it is also a website. Please visit speakingofjung.com, where you will find extensive information on the life and work of C.G. Jung, show notes and audio downloads for all of our 160 episodes, a comprehensive books page, a blog, and now a monthly email newsletter, which you can sign up for at the bottom of our front page. All of our episodes are also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to this channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. I created Speaking of Jung almost 10 years ago. This year is our 10th anniversary, and all of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. Please consider contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or visit our support page at speakingofjung.com/support for links on all the ways you can help keep this podcast and our website alive. So with special thanks to Ivory Fields at Sounds True, and to everyone at the C.G. Jung Center of Houston, Texas, I'm Laura London, and you've been watching The Borrowed Dust of Speaking of Jung.